that on Tuesday. So we are, this is I think the plan for today, is we're in the middle of this social behavior chapter. So we'll spend the first big chunk of today working through the remaining slides on this chapter, and then we should have time to start talking about the homework. Thursday we'll finish up any remaining homework discussion and then launch into chapter 13, which is like the second part of the social behavior chapters. I forget exactly what they call it, but effectively it's social behavior 2. And it takes sort of a more, a broader look, I think, at social behavior once we have the main principles in hand that we'll be talking about today. We do have a lab this week. It's our last real lab, and the lab for this week is going to be our human mate preference lab. So we will be, it's always kind of fun. So we are going to make phony Match.com accounts. We are not going to actually interact with anybody because we do not have IRB approval to do any kind of interaction. We are just going to go on and observe advertisements that have been posted on Match.com by men and by women in some town where we do not know anyone. We had somebody once we were doing this and they found their gym teacher, so we don't want that. So we're going to be looking elsewhere and looking at Match.com advertisements and trying to understand whether or not there's anything we can predict or explain or understand about the apparent preferences or the strategies that are used by people on Match.com to solicit mating opportunities, because I think it is kind of fun to apply some of this stuff to humans, and I think what we can find is that in some cases humans follow suit pretty well from what we'd expect from classic animal behavior theory. So that's the goal for lab this week. It's fun. And then if you look at the schedule, the term papers are due at midnight that night. I've met with a lot of people about them. If you haven't met with me, today's kind of full, but there's a little bit of time right after class today that I have, and then certainly tomorrow and maybe even into Thursday, or we can do some email. That would be fine if you still want to meet and talk about your outline. Okay? Any questions about anything? Russian literature. All right. So where we were, if you remember, we were talking about slime molds. And I think slime molds are really interesting because they have this, I mean, they are basically these individual solitary little cells for most of their lives, but then they will come together at times of food scarcity, and instead of being little units, they become this kind of pseudo multicellular organism. I mean, basically a multicellular organism. I think that makes them really interesting. Here's a little video just to give you a feel for how these guys work. Let's see. So this will show you at least some of the large sort of multicellular stages of these things. So there's the slug stage, for example. Let me just play the video. I think there's sound. They're all aggregating together. I love him. So happy. Okay, so I think these guys, I'm convinced if I'd heard about these earlier in my career, I would have probably studied them. I just think they're so cool because they have this tendency to shift from multicellular to unicellular organism and back and forth. And also because of this really interesting question about why are they doing what they're doing. And, you know, you can, because ultimately, the big puzzle for me about these guys is that those individuals, I mean, they all start off, these are all viable cells. And these cells, ultimately, a good chunk of them will basically die in the process of forming this fruiting body. So the 80% or so of all the amoebas will form this sort of large stalk structure, and only a small percentage, about 20% of them, will be up there in the fruiting body and will get to turn into spores and then disperse in the air and then, you know, found a new group. And so as a result, you have this, you know, tremendous apparent altruism that's happening across these organisms. So we have complete giving up of all reproductive success by 80% of the population. Only 20% actually get to reproduce effectively by forming these spores. So that, I think, is a really interesting problem. And you could make an argument that this is something that's done for the good of the species or the good of the group, right? So this could be, we could make a group selection argument, we'll call it, where groups that do this kind of self-sacrifice, some of those individuals will survive and reproduce, and therefore the group will survive effectively in those lineages. And so maybe groups that do this self-sacrifice are doing better than others. But I think probably this doesn't, that logic probably won't ultimately hold up. So maybe we can sort of talk through this, and I think this will explain why maybe that logic doesn't hold up. And you know, you did this a bit on the homework already too. So if we start by assuming that all the amoebae, so this would be amoeba plural, all the amoebae cells are equally likely to become stalk cells or fruiting body cells. In that sort of situation, then you could have this kind of group, this group selection could be working, and this would be advantageous for the group, that some of the individuals would actually survive and therefore the group would persist, whereas other groups that don't do this wouldn't get to do this kind of behavior, therefore they would all basically die out. But once, if we're starting by assuming that all the amoebae are equally likely, what do you think would happen if we added just one little faster individual? So if that individual is a little bit of a faster crawling amoeba, and as a result, it's able to crawl up into the top of the fruiting body and become a spore cell more likely or more often than the other cells. So if you've got, you know, everybody else is kind of like normal speed, and you have this one little faster individual, what do you think is likely to happen to this population? What do you think? Yeah, so if we have a faster individual, then that individual is very likely to get up into the fruiting body. So that individual is probably going to get to reproduce, which means in the next generation, we have more and more of these faster individuals. And so we'll have progressively this situation where the faster individuals will kind of overtake all the slower individuals. And so we're going to run into a situation where kind of nobody wants to be in the fruiting body. I'm sorry, nobody wants to be in the stalk. Everybody is basically being selected to be in the fruiting body. And so this becomes a problem because you have a self-interest of individuals that's competing with the self-interest of the group. And usually what's going to happen is that any sort of selection on individuals will be really powerful, and it's going to select individuals to not give of themselves and give up their own reproductive success. It's going to favor the individuals that are effectively being selfish and not cooperative. So this is ultimately the problem with a lot of these kinds of good of the group or good of the species kinds of arguments, is that if somebody is giving up of their own reproductive success for the good of the group, they're not going to last long in the population because there's going to be some other variant that's going to be selfish. And the selfish individuals, frankly, they're always going to win, which kind of sucks, right? It's sort of like a terrible moral lesson. But that is kind of the problem here with these arguments, is that ultimately, you know, groups of self-sacrificing individuals are very, very susceptible to the invasion of some selfish individual that will basically take advantage of them. So we need some other kind of an argument here. So this is kind of a summary of all this. So I think group selection, this idea that groups can compete against each other and individuals would do things for the benefit of their group or the benefit of their species, I think it's an appealing idea. So the argument would be that groups consisting of selfless individuals will do better than groups that have selfish individuals. there's no I in team thing. But the problem is, ultimately, that logic doesn't hold up, because selfish individuals should always outcompete anybody else in that group that acts selflessly. The selfish individuals usually will win within individual groups. And so while a group might do better if everybody was acting individually, the overall population probably won't last very long, because some individuals will sort of invade who are going to be selfish, and that will be a favored trait. To me, the analog is always like, I don't know, if you've sat much in traffic. I was just hearing you talk about sitting in traffic, and you get people, you know, you every once in a while you'll run into these traffic jams that are apparently caused by nothing. And what often probably has happened is that people will be kind of darting back and forth and weaving in and out and causing people to hit their brakes, because the certain individuals are not sort of going with the group and not being cooperative. So a really good example of this is when you get into a construction thing where you've got like a highway and there's 3 lanes and you're all converging down to the 1 lane, right? And so if everybody just kind of took their turns and got in line, nice and steady, we would have nice flow of traffic through that area. But instead what happens is you'll have a couple people, and I've done this before too, but we'll have a couple people that will dart around the whole group, fly a mile ahead up the line, and then try to cut over, which makes everybody hit the brakes, which means everybody slows down. And the result is that you have this, 5-mile-an-hour procedure through this merging area where it's just really not necessary. And this is the problem ultimately with these group things. Like it isn't beneficial to the individuals oftentimes to play along and play nice with the overall group. And the same thing we think happens in these kinds of scenarios. So even though the group would benefit from altruism, from self-sacrifice, selfless individuals in the group will usually be replaced by selfish individuals, because selfish individuals will outcompete them. So that's frustrating, right? I mean, that means that ultimately maybe true altruism we should never expect to see favored by selection. And the tricky thing about that, though, is that while this argument seems to make it clear that we shouldn't see any self-sacrifice of individuals, it seems to happen. And it seems to happen pretty regularly. So we still see apparent examples of selfless behavior. So we need to have some other explanation for this selfless behavior. And the best explanation that I have seen, and the explanation that is favored within the discipline by and large, is this idea about inclusive fitness that came from this guy W.D. Hamilton, who was he was in a newer generation of evolutionary biologists. So he was sort of after the Ernst Mayr generation and the Fisher group and all these people that did the new synthesis of evolutionary biologists. He was kind of on the cutting edge of the next group. He unfortunately died really young. He died of malaria. I think he was in his late 30s, early 40s or something, so he was very young when he passed away, but he still made some really impressive contributions to the field. His argument is that altruistic favors can be favored by selection because they can actually enhance the propagation of an individual's alleles. So the alleles that I am carrying could be passed on if I am being altruistic. And the key thing is, I could do this one of 2 ways. I could do this by personally reproducing, and that's sort of the classic way. And he called this direct fitness. So your direct fitness is the reproductive success that you get just by producing your own offspring. So your genes are passed on to your offspring, and therefore they are into the next generation. Nice and clean and neat. But he realized you could also accomplish this by helping your relatives, because they have some of the same alleles that you do. They don't have all the same alleles you have, but they have a lot of the same alleles that you have, especially if they're a close relative, a parent or a sibling. Those individuals share a lot of genes with you, and so if you help them to reproduce, that will mean more of the genes that they have that you also have will go into the next generation. So that he called indirect fitness. This does get kind of confusing because we were talking about direct and indirect benefits earlier in the semester. And it's kind of a different idea here. We're using direct and indirect, but here we're talking about direct fitness is your own direct reproductive success, your offspring that you're producing. Indirect fitness would be the extra offspring that you're helping is allowing your siblings or parents or other close relatives to produce. In order to properly assess this, we need to understand this idea of the coefficient of relatedness, which I know it came up on the homework, so hopefully you're feeling comfortable with it. But if not, we'll give it a chance to kind of to give you a chance to cover it. So the way I like to explain this is if you assume that you've got, for one particular locus, you've got a heterozygous genotype. So your genotype is big A, little a. You know, some classic genetics problem that we had from back in Bio 111. In that case, whenever you produce a gamete, whether it's an egg or whether it's a sperm, your offspring will get one of those two alleles, a big A or a little a. That's how we do this. It's this idea of segregation and independent. Well, segregation is the key bit here. They will also get one other allele from your mate, and therefore my offspring's relatedness to me would be 0.5 because they have one of my alleles that I gave them, and then they've got one allele from my wife. Okay, so I've got a 50% relatedness. With each of my kids, they have one gene for me, and they've got one allele from me, and they've got one allele from my wife, and that's happening at each genetic locus that they have across their entire genotype. On average, so this is parent-offspring relatedness, but on average, siblings also share 50% of the alleles as well. So you can go through and work it out. But if they have a 50-50 chance of getting the same allele from me, and they have a 50-50 chance of getting the same allele from their mom, so they could have both of the same alleles, they could have neither, they could have 50-50. On average, it works out that siblings share about 50% of their alleles, so they have a relatedness coefficient of about 0.5. So because of all of this, we can now start to model exactly how related is one individual to another individual. And therefore, we can start to get an idea of what is the payoff to helping that other individual. Your payoff in terms of the number of genes that you get into the next generation via indirect fitness, your payoff is going to be bigger the more closely related they are to you, the higher this relatedness coefficient. The less close related they are, so if you start looking at nieces and nephews or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, those relatedness coefficients start to drop because your genes are starting to get diluted by all the other genes that got into that person's lineage. So here's a way that we can sort of model how all this might work. So here what I've got, this sort of set up like a little genetics problem. So I've got a male, and we're just going to look at one locus, but what applies or what works at one locus also works across, if we just sort of scale it up across all the different loci. So here we're going to give the male, we'll give them a genotype of A, B, and for the female we'll give them a genotype of C, D. And I'm just not sharing letters between these because I want to keep track of which letter came from which parent. So the male would produce gametes. He could produce sperm that have an A in them, or he could produce gametes that have a B in them. And the same thing would be true of the female. She could produce eggs that have a C or eggs that have a D in them. And she's going to give one of her alleles at each locus to each gamete. That's all straight Bio 111 right now. So if we go and just allow each of these sperms, we could do a Punnett square if you want, each of these sperm to connect with each of these eggs, so we get all the different possible combinations, we could produce an offspring that is an AC offspring, or an AD offspring, or a BC offspring, or a BD offspring, right? So these are all the possible offspring that these two parents could have at that one locus. And then what we could do is that we can compare the alleles that each parent has to their offspring. So this male AB, he's always going to have one allele that his offspring also has. So he's got one of the two alleles for this one. He's got one of the two alleles in common with this child, one of the two alleles with this one, and one of the two alleles with this one. So the relatedness coefficient between this parent and each of those offspring is always going to be 0.5. Always, always, always. Does that make sense? Somebody nod knowingly. Okay, I see a few knowing nods. That's good. And the same would be true of this female, right? So CD, there's a C or a D in each of these offspring, but not both, right? So she's only giving one of her alleles. So it's always the case that the parent shares one allele with each offspring, so the parent-offspring relatedness is 0.5 or 50%. We can also compare across the siblings. So if you happen to be an AC offspring and you're comparing to all your possible siblings, each sibling could be one of these 4 possibilities, right? So you could have other siblings that got AC. There could be other siblings that are AD or BC or BD. But in all these different cases, there's some kind of a comparison here. So if you're an AC offspring, we can calculate how many of these alleles that you're sharing with each of those siblings. So if you are AC and you're comparing to another AC offspring, you've got a 100% relatedness at that locus. If you compare to an AD offspring, you've got a 50% relatedness. If you compare to a BC, it's 50% because you're sharing the C, but you're not sharing the first letter. And then to a BD, there's 0 relatedness, right? So you could have siblings that, at least at one locus, you have 0 relatedness to them. And in theory, that could happen across your whole genome if you just like completely sort of win the lottery, I guess, in terms of genetic recombination or genetic segregation. So that means across these 4 different offspring types, we have 100% relatedness, 50%, 50%, and 0%. If we take the average of all those, that'd be a 0.5, right? So 1 plus 0.5 plus 0.5 would be 2, plus 0 is 2, divided by 4 is 0.5. So what this means is that for an AC offspring, there's an average of 50% relatedness across all the different siblings. It won't be the same for each sibling necessarily, but on average, a sibling is about a 50% relatedness. Does that make sense? Because these can be, I'm kind of going over this. I know you hopefully saw it on your homework, but this is sometimes challenging. Just to get your head wrapped around it. Once it clicks, I think it's fine. It's just a matter of doing it. I would invite you, I'm not going to do it for you, but I would invite you, if this is at all fuzzy, go ahead and do the same exercise for an AD offspring. Compare an AD offspring to all of its possible siblings and do it for the other ones as well. What you should find is that on average, there's a 50% relatedness across all of them. And then we can start to do sort of multi-step things. So by extension, if we know parent-offspring relatedness is always 0.5, and we know that full sibling relatedness is always 0.5, or at least on average is 0.5, we can start to estimate what's the relatedness between more distant relatives. So, and we can do it because these are basically probabilities. I like to think of it as sort of like each step that you go, if you go from parent to offspring or from sibling to sibling, each step, that's like a 50% halving of your relatedness. You're sort of dividing your relatedness in half. So if we go if we're looking at my niece, I don't actually have a niece, but let's say I did. I do have a sister, so my relatedness to my sister should be 0.5. And if my sister had children, her relatedness to her children would be 0.5. And these are, again, I'm sort of losing half of my relatedness each time. So you can sort of think of this as this is about a 50% loss of relatedness to go to my sister, and then another 50% loss of relatedness to go down to the niece. And so what we would just do mathematically is you just go 0.5 times 0.5. And so my relatedness to a niece would be 0.25. And you can do this if you're going, we can do this across multiple levels, and this comes up on the homework. So I don't want to beleaguer it much more because we'll come back to this, but you can go from great-grandparents to grandchildren to some like grandniece if you want to go really crazy. All you're basically doing is for each step, you're multiplying by 0.5 because you're losing about a 50% relatedness with each step that you do, either going from sibling to sibling or parent to offspring. Okay? At least as far as mammals or most other sane organisms work. And we'll talk about the exception for that too. So this is really a nice framework now. So we've got this idea of how it is that, how closely, quantitatively, how closely related, how many genes are we sharing with other individuals that we might interact with based on how closely related they are to us. So you could then start to apply this to this question of altruism and try to ask, why is it that some individuals would be altruistic? So I'll ask you to consider basically 2 behaviors. One would be sort of to be a selfish individual. And if you're a selfish individual, you're basically just focusing exclusively on your own offspring. And by focusing on your own offspring, you will successfully rear that one offspring on average to adulthood. Maybe sometimes you get 2, sometimes you get 0. On average, you're getting 1 successful offspring to adulthood. So this would be favored by direct selection, where this would be selection favoring your own reproduction. You could also do an altruistic behavior, where you give up your own reproduction altogether, but you are able to help produce 3 additional nephews or nieces who otherwise would not have made it, who would otherwise not have survived. So this would be indirect selection, right? So this is where you're benefiting because some of your alleles are in those nieces and nephews, and therefore your alleles are being passed on to the next generation, even though you didn't actually reproduce in this manner. So given this, which one of these would have the higher fitness? We call it inclusive fitness. So if we sort of calculate what's the total direct fitness and the total indirect fitness, that would be the inclusive fitness. Which one has higher inclusive fitness of these two? Or how could we figure that out? Ideas? We've always talked about fitness as like the number of offspring that you produce. But I mean, I think what we could say is really what we're trying to find out is how many of your genes were passed on to the next generation in these two scenarios. Maybe we can do the direct one first. So we actually have to do a little bit of math. It's not hard. So the first one, we've got one individual. This is our offspring, one offspring. And what's our relatedness to that one offspring if that's our own offspring? This is our it's 50%, right? So this is parent to offspring. So we've got a 50% relatedness, so we can just take this one individual, multiply it by 0.5, that's our relatedness. And that means that there is, on average, we're getting about 0.5 or 50% of our genes are getting to the next generation through that approach. Not great, but you know, we're getting some. For the other one though, so if we're getting 3, let's say we get lucky and we get 3 nieces instead of 3 nephews. I don't know. What's the relatedness that we have to each of our nieces or nephews? On average. Yeah, it's 25. So our relatedness is lower. We're not getting as many of our genes into the next generation per individual, because these are nieces or nephews. But we're getting 3 extra nieces or nephews into the next generation. So if our helping is allowing 3 extra nieces, so we provide shelter or food or whatever it is that allows us to get 3 extra nieces or nephews, each one is worth less to us because they're only related by 0.25 instead of 0.5. But overall, we get 3 times 0.25 equals 0.75, right? So you can think of these numbers. These are effectively I don't even know if you can read my writing. I wrote, these numbers basically mean these are the percent of your genes that got to the next generation. So we're getting 0.5 here, we're getting 0.75 here, so we're getting a larger proportion of our genes into the next generation using this helping altruistic approach in this scenario if these numbers are correct. So it would actually be beneficial in this case to be a helper, because your payoff is better. You're getting more of your genes in the next generation by helping your relatives than you are by going it alone and being selfish in this scenario. Does that make sense? Questions on it? Yeah. So I think the key thing with the indirect selection is that in order for it to count, it would have to be additional offspring that they're getting based on your behavior. So if my sister went and had 2 kids on her own, but I didn't do anything, I never gave them Christmas presents or anything else, that shouldn't really count for me, because it's not a result in terms of selection on my behavior. That shouldn't really affect the selection on my behavior because I'm not doing anything to facilitate that. So in this case, the choice is basically between doing, only focusing on your own reproduction or actually helping her produce 3 extra offspring she wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. That's really got to be where the choice is. And that's a lot. That means I'm really helping somehow. I'm throwing extravagant parties or something that's making those kids survive better. I mean, it's better probably take this out of human realm and put it into more like maybe these are meadow-voles or something. And so you're provisioning with more food or something that you're doing that's helping, that's allowing much higher success rate, much higher survival rate of offspring as a result of your helping. Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right. So one more kind of theory bit. So Hamilton has this equation. This is called Hamilton's equation. And it's an equation, so some people kind of shut down the moment an equation appears on the screen, but it's not bad. Let's just sort of talk this through. What this is saying is that if the benefit, so B stands for benefit, this would be the extra relatives that are produced by your altruism, by your self-sacrificing behavior. The benefit times the relatedness to those extra relatives. So that's what we did up there, basically. If that total, the B times the relatedness, is greater than the cost would be your own offspring that you're giving up by being self-sacrificing and altruistic, because you're not trying to reproduce your own offspring, and your relatedness to your own offspring, which would be RC. If this value together is greater than this value, then you should see altruistic behavior evolving. So when we did these calculations over here, this would have been B. This would have been R sub B. So this times this was 0.75. The one offspring, this would be what you're giving up by being altruistic. So this would be C. This would be R sub C. This is your relatedness to your own offspring. So the first part of the value, B times RB, was 0.75, and that was greater than C times RC, which was 0.5. And so under that scenario, we would assume that selection should favor this altruistic behavior. Now, I mean, this is just a canned little example, but this is, I think, fundamental to understanding why we see a lot of altruistic behaviors, because it appears altruistic, but in truth, really what's going on there is that they are doing this behavior because it's allowing, I mean, they don't know why they're doing it, but selection has favored this behavior because it's allowing more of those alleles, that individual's alleles, to get passed to the next generation. So these altruistic alleles are really, kind of self-serving, because you're trying to get more of your genes to the next generation. And you're doing so by helping your relatives. Okay? So that kind of sets up, we'll come back to that a little bit on the homework, and that's going to set up a lot of what we talk about in the next chapter. One of the sort of pinnacle examples of really cooperative organisms, though, include these eusocial insects that we've been talking about. So the ants and the bees and such, where you do have all these workers that do completely give up all their own reproductive success for the benefit of the queen. And so we have to try to understand how is it that they are, or why is it that they are doing this. And I think the key to understanding this is, again, this idea of Hamilton's rule, because in all these cases, the workers are giving up their own reproductive success, but they are helping their mother. And their mother is producing more siblings, some of which will be reproductives and will go on to found their own colonies. So they are benefiting by giving up their reproductive success, but they're helping their mother's reproductive success. And they do have that strong relatedness with her. And the cool thing about them, frankly, is that they're not just related to her, they're kind of like, in many cases, they're sort of ultra or, super related to her. So there's weird things that go on when we start looking at these really eusocial animals. Okay, so I need to take a step back. So I've been using this term eusocial. So eusocial is going to, when we use eusocial, we're talking about a really extreme form of altruism that involves castes of sterile workers. So these are workers that cannot reproduce anymore, helping to promote the reproduction of fertile relatives. So again, there's this idea with Hamilton's rule, and we could look at this and try to figure out, so what sorts of conditions would allow them to be more likely to choose the altruistic behavior versus the sort of more selfish behavior, classically selfish behavior, where they're just trying to reproduce on their own. So what sorts of conditions or what sorts of factors, if we look at these coefficients, like these different variables that are in here, what could cause this number to get bigger, this number to get smaller, to favor altruism, as you're looking up here? What kinds of things could we, what kinds of things will make altruistic behavior more likely to evolve? Yeah, go ahead. I'll get you started. Okay, yeah, so we need good relatedness amongst relatives, right? And the higher this number is, the more related relatives are, the more benefit there is to helping a relative. So we need the relatedness between relatives to get really high, ideally. Maybe even higher than 0.5 if we can swing that. And there are some ways that that can happen. Certainly we don't want it going under 0.5. And that can, you know, if you start getting lots of half-siblings and stuff roaming around, half-siblings, you know, are basically related by about 0.25 with each other, so that can really screw up your relatedness coefficient. So we need this number to be high. What else could be helpful? Any other things jump to mind? I mean, really, we could play with any of these numbers, right? So the more benefit that you can have, so the more your behavior can result in additional offspring being produced by your relative, that should promote the altruistic behavior. So, you know, effectively, the more efficient you are in terms of your helpful behavior. I think this one's really interesting too, right? So this is the cost that you're paying. So if you have a scenario where, bless you, where, you know, there's decent benefits, if we can drive down this cost number to be really low, then it starts to become a no-brainer. And one of the ways you could do that is if it's really unlikely that you'd be able to survive and reproduce on your own. So if you are, you know, part of one of these big ant colonies do really well on their own, but you could sort of imagine if you're a little worker ant and you roamed off and tried to become a reproductive, if selection had some mutant that allowed that to happen, it could be really unlikely you're going to be successful. So maybe the cost in terms of how many offspring you could realistically expect to actually be able to produce on your own, this number might get to be really, really low. So again, if these numbers get higher, or if the cost gets really low, then that's going to promote a situation where you're going to have a higher likelihood of eusociality, altruism occurring within a population. So that's what this says. So altruism, and by extension, eusociality, will be favored whenever the opportunities for producing your own offspring are pretty poor. So you don't have much chance of going it alone anyway. So there's low cost. And the relatedness between siblings starts to get really high. And there's many different ways we can play with these numbers. So especially in terms of relatedness, that's actually where we're going to focus. One way that you can certainly increase relatedness is via monogamy. So like we just sort of said, if you have full siblings should have about a 50% relatedness between one another. Half siblings, though, you've got one parent that you're sharing, but the other parent you're not sharing, and therefore you don't have those genes in common. And so that really starts to reduce the relatedness. It actually drops to about 0.25 between half siblings. And therefore, anytime you have multiple mates, so you have non-monogamous situations, your relatedness coefficient starts to drop. So the result of that is I think we could predict that if you have monogamous parents, monogamous parents within a population are going to result in higher relatedness coefficients, and therefore eusocial species should be more likely to evolve from those kinds of scenarios. So we should see eusocial species should be descended from monogamous ancestors more often than they should be descended from polygamous ancestors. Here's a figure that kind of shows that. So, do I have my legend? Yeah, here it is on the side. So on this figure, the red bars, it's kind of covered up here, so I'm looking here. So the red bars are females that mate with several males within this group of bees. The blue bars are monogamous individuals. And then the dotted lines are females that typically mate with more than 2 males. So you can kind of think of the 2 red lines as basically both polygamous lines, but the blue lines are the ones that are monogamous. And so what you can do is, if you look up in these are bees, and there's also some wasps in here, but you can see that, so the actual honeybee that we all know and love, that's Apis, so that's this group right here. Bombus are bumblebees. There's a couple other groups that that I've recognized. So Melaponia is another one of these sort of eusocial groups that have a lot of bees that are highly social. So this within the bees, most of these lineages are actually fairly eusocial, if not actually genuinely eusocial organisms. And what you can see here is in terms of their mating system, most of them are monogamous, and so we think that the ancestor of all the bees, which would be this group here, these guys are all monogamous as well. It is the case that honeybees are actually polygamous, which is kind of interesting, but the argument here is that what likely happened with them is that they're descended from a monogamous ancestor. After they got the behavior of being eusocial kind of established within the population, then we started to see polygamy happening. So that's kind of an interesting case, and actually the same thing seems to be happening with bombus. But in any case, we do see that within this lineage, by and large, almost everybody is monogamous. And so that's consistent with this idea that monogamy is a factor that helps to drive up relatedness and therefore promote eusociality. There's a couple other interesting ones. So inbreeding is another one we'll talk about on the homework, and you've seen before. But I think that one's, that's another interesting way to drive up your relatedness coefficient. Here's one other, though, and this is one, if you tried to figure this out in the homework, it may have been really confusing. We also have this haplodiploidy system within certain groups of insects, and the group of insects that have this are the hymenopterans. Hymenopterans include bees and ants and wasps, which is not coincidentally a place where we see lots and lots of species that are really, really eusocial. And the argument with this haplodiploidy hypothesis is that the weird sex determination system that these groups happen to have kind of made them almost like pre-selected for being susceptible to becoming eusocial. And here's why. This haplodiploid system that they have results in really high relatedness among siblings. So let's kind of walk through it. So it's called haplodiploid sex determination, and the reason for that is that all the females are diploid. So if you are diploid, you develop as female. If you are haploid, though, so if you only have one of each kind of chromosome, there are individuals that are haploid within these species. Those individuals are all male. So that's what determines if you're male or female. It's not an X or XX, XY system like we have. Instead, it's do you get one set of chromosomes or do you have 2 sets of chromosomes? And we're used to diploid organisms, but the males in this case are all haploid. So that means that there are differences in terms of how individuals generate gametes. So if you are female, you're diploid like most other organisms we've ever seen. So if we start trying to figure out what kinds of gametes they can make, here what they're showing are 2 different chromosomes, and this would be basically like she has 2 different kinds of chromosomes because she's diploid. She's got one that they're shading blue and one that they're shading in red. And you could sort of imagine maybe she got the red one from her dad and the blue one from her mom. Okay. And then she also has chromosome 2, and then in that case she's got 2 of those chromosomes as well. She's got a blue one and a red one. And we can kind of trace through and figure out what kinds of eggs could she make. So we know from Bio 111 she'll give one of each of her kinds of chromosomes to each of her gametes. So she'll give one blue or one of these sort of straight line chromosomes to each of her gametes. Could be a blue one, or it could be a red one. She'll also give one of her little crooked chromosomes, chromosome B, to each of her gametes. So again, it could be a blue one or it could be a red one. And so we'll get all the different possible combinations. You could get 2 blues, 2 reds, a blue and a red and a blue. So that's the kinds of gametes that she could make, and that's because she's diploid. The males, being haploid, they only have one of each kind of chromosome. They have one straight one and they have one crooked one. And they kind of made them dotted lines here just so you could kind of figure out which one came from the male. But that means that they're going to give still one of each kind of chromosome to each gamete, so they can only make one kind of sperm. It's this one. It's got the dotted line blue and the broken line blue. Okay. So now, if this male mates with this female, then she could generate 4 different egg types. Well, he will have his sperm mating with each of her 4 different egg types, producing 4 different offspring types. And so if we sort of trace them through, have this gamete hit this egg, that produces this offspring. If this gamete hits this egg, that produces this offspring, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And if you go through and compare the relatedness of the mother to each of the siblings, or each of the offspring that she could generate, you still have this nice 0.5 relatedness between mother and offspring, because on average, well, not even on average, she will, each of her offspring, these are all female offspring, of course, because they're diploid, each of these offspring have one chromosome set in common with her and one chromosome set not in common with her that came from the father. So she always still has a 50% relatedness. So that's not really different yet. We also, it's a little bit weird to try to figure out like how should you calculate it, but each of these offspring also have a 50% relatedness with their father, we could put it, because they have half of their genes they share with their father, but the other half of their genes they do not share with their father. So we can also still claim there's a 50% relatedness with the father. What's interesting, though, is when you start comparing across siblings. So that's what they've done here. So we took, in this example, we're going to take this one type of offspring, which is this sort of blue, red, blue, blue offspring. So there it is, blue, red, blue, blue. And we're then going to compare how many chromosomes that offspring has in common with each of her possible sisters. So we could have sister type A, type B, type C, type D. Type C is the same type she is. And so all we're going to do is just count up how many of her chromosomes, what percentage of her chromosomes are shared across each of these individuals. So this individual shares this blue one, and then the dotted blue one, and then the crooked dotted blue one. Those are all shared, but they do not share this chromosome. So this one's a red one and this one's a blue one over here. So 3 of the 4 chromosomes are shared between these 2 sisters. You can play the same game with this one. They share everything except for this, this one linear one. This one's blue, this one's red, so that's not shared, but the rest are. This one is 100% shared. This one, they got different chromosomes from their mother, but they're always getting the same chromosomes from their father because their father could only generate one kind of gamete, right? So this would be 50% relatedness because half of them are shared, but the other half are not. So you could go through then and you could calculate, all right, what's the average here? It would be 0.75 plus 0.75 plus 1 plus 0.5. Divide that by 4. And it turns out that the average relatedness between all these sisters is 0.75 now. I mean, that's a much bigger number, right? So we're used to seeing relatedness between siblings of 0.5. Now we're another 25% higher. We're at 0.75. So sisters have a higher relatedness to each other than they actually do to their own mother. And that they have a higher relatedness, probably more importantly, they have a higher relatedness between each other than they would even have to their own offspring. So, I mean, this is sort of a bizarro case where it's more advantageous to them in terms of getting offspring or getting gene to the next generation to produce more sisters than to produce their own individual offspring at all. So, again, worker ants get more inclusive fitness by helping their mother produce more siblings because they've got such high relatedness coefficient to siblings than they do by reproducing themselves. So their RB number is 0.75. Their RC, this would be the relatedness to their own offspring, is 0.5. So this number is actually higher than this number. It's bizarre. Now this does assume a monogamy, and that becomes a problem when you start working with honeybees that are not monogamous, but at least it works for a lot of eusocial species that are hymenopterans. How are you feeling with that? Is that okay? Questions? But I'm hoping you got to see it on the homework. You got to hear it again now. Hopefully it's starting to click. If it's not, that's okay. Don't panic, but I'd recommend going back and rereading through the section. If you still don't get it, like, come to me. I'm happy to work you through it. I do want you to be able to understand how these haploid-diploid systems work. Because the consequence of all of this is that because if this idea is true, and it seems to be well supported in at least some species, the consequence of all this is that not that all hymenopterans who have a haploid-diploid system have to be eusocial, and they're not. Not all of them are. But this kind of predisposes them for selection to favor helpful kinds of behavior, because the more you can help produce more siblings, the more your reproductive success will tend to be. Should pause. Okay, so let's talk about how this could actually be tested. There's a whole, like, this is a huge literature, and this is kind of where my head usually starts to hurt. So, you know, and it's frankly really contentious too. So if you know the labs, and I knew a couple labs that were doing this at Arizona State, and they just get into huge squabbles with other competing labs where they're all trying to figure this stuff out. It is certainly the case that the haplodiploidy hypothesis is not universally accepted as something that is super, super important. But here are some lines that do seem to support this idea, at least in some cases. All right, so sister workers on average should have a relatedness of 0.5 with one, or 0.75 with one another. But if you go back and do all these calculations and figure out what they would have with their haploid brothers, they have about a relatedness of about 0.25 with their haploid brothers. So they're not very closely related with haploid brothers at all. The brothers are basically produced from unfertilized eggs. So the female basically just produces eggs, never fertilizes them, and they develop as brothers, as males. But given that there is this dichotomy then in terms of the relatedness that they have with one another, the sisters have with one another, versus the relatedness that they have with brothers, you would predict that the worker bees or worker ants should invest more resources into their sisters than they should into their brothers. Queens, on the other hand, if you go back and figure it out, they still have a relatedness of 0.5 with their sons and 0.5 with their daughters, so the queens should be equally interested in investing in both males and females in terms of their offspring. So you have a little bit of a conflict then within the colony where workers are basically in the business of producing more sisters, but queens should be in the business of producing both sons and daughters, at least in terms of their reproductives, so that because she has equal relatedness to each of them. So the prediction there is that while workers should invest more resources into sisters, queens should lay about equal numbers of male and female eggs. And on average, and these would be male and female reproductive eggs, not necessarily worker eggs. And it usually actually does work out to be there is some signature here. So if you look at all the reproductives, so all the princesses that would leave the colony to go off and found their own colonies, and all the drone males that would go off and try to mate with those princesses up in the air when they do their big mating flights, the biomass of the reproductives is usually skewed about 3 to 1 males to females. So that means that there's about 3 times the mass of princesses that there are masses of drones. That's a direct result of who the workers are feeding. The queen ends up laying about equal numbers of eggs. So she's laying equal numbers of male versus female eggs. So she's trying to get 50-50. The workers are biasing who they're feeding to produce about 3 times as many, 3 times as many females as males in terms of their overall size and biomass that they're investing in. So there is this is one of many lines of evidence that does support this idea that this haplodiploidy idea really does make a difference in terms of the way selection works upon these ants and on bees. But despite all that, there are counter-arguments. There are examples of eusocial animals that are not haplodiploid, so termites, naked mole rats, these kinds of things. So certainly haplodiploid is not necessary to be eusocial. And there are all kinds of problems or complaints that people will have about this haplodiploidy hypothesis, not the least of which is that in many cases you don't have perfect monogamy, and so all these reproductive coefficients drive down. It's a really complicated field, but I at least want you to understand sort of the argument here. And this is kind of foundational to figuring out where we go and how this whole batch of literature kind of fits together. Any questions? So I hadn't done one in a while. I had not done one in a while. I was going to do a Kahoot. We're kind of short on time, though. I love doing them, but I'm sorry not. But I think we're not going to do it because I want to give you time to start talking about the homework. So I'm going to stop here, give you guys some time to start talking out the homework because there's application of many of these ideas that come back on the homework, and I want to make sure we have time to talk those out. So I'm going to pause there. This is the original. This is Gary Larson, Far Side. You guys know Gary Larson, Far Side still, or is that still relevant? I mean, he stopped doing cartoons when I was a kid, but he was the original, but he's so good. But in any case, like this is the argument about these guys, is you always hear they all go off and they commit suicide to save the species or save the population. And this cartoon, I think, does a very good job pointing out the problem with that kind of argument of there's no way selection would probably favor individuals that give up and just kill themselves for the good of the population. So what is the logical problem here, and what's it illustrating? So who did I give this to? This one went to Kristen.
I said that Hamilton's rule states that the benefit of altruistic behavior. The benefits of altruistic behavior towards genetically related members outweighs the costs.
All right. What is the cartoon showing?
And then I said the cartoon shows like how individuals will do altruistic behavior to ensure like the survival of the species rather than the individual's success because it maintains like some of their genes in the gene pool.
Yeah, so is he being altruistic? Do you think? Like, so there's this guy, right? So do you think he's being altruistic, or is he? I think I might have gotten you confused with Hamilton rule, but like, what do you guys think? Like, what's he doing? So if the argument of why they're doing this is that they're giving up themselves so that the species can survive and not be overpopulated, and he's doing this, like, what's he doing? He's cheating, right? Like he's totally cheating the system. So he is supposed to be committing suicide under this sort of save the population, prevent overpopulation problem. But he's not going to. He's got a little dinner tube, and so he's probably going to survive. And yet all these guys are going to kill themselves. So he'll survive and reproduce. And if there's a heritable component to using inner tubes in lemmings, then there'll be more inner tube using lemmings in the next generation. And subsequently, we'd expect that to continue to invade, and you'd have even more and even more and even more if all these other guys keep killing themselves and these guys keep surviving. Eventually, everybody's going to have an inner tube, right? No, I don't think so. I think he's just like saying, I'm not gonna kill myself. He's like, nope. That's my interpretation of the cartoon. But I think this is the idea: is that like if you've got some variation that allows you to cheat the system and not self-sacrifice when everybody else is self-sacrificing, that's going to help your survival. It's going to help your reproductive success. And so that will be favored by selection when everybody else is just going ahead and killing, committing suicide. So let me try to talk that out. I didn't really think about how I was going to write this. So Curtin shows that individuals with an advantage to survival will probably survive. That's kind of tautological. So you can't read what I'm writing. It's off the screen. Let me try this. So I said the cartoon shows that individuals with an advantage of survival will probably survive, and therefore they'll continue to reproduce, and they will therefore outcompete individuals who are self-sacrificing for the good of the, I don't know why I wrote trouble, the good of the group. Selfish behavior will almost always outcompete selfless behavior, I wrote. Unless we have some kind of a relatedness thing going on. That's the only way we can kind of save it. And that's the way it starts to make sense for individuals. But if all these guys are unrelated, it would make sense to be the individual that has, well, selection will favor the individuals that are not self-sacrificing. Because why would you do that? Like, what's the point? Selection is going to favor individuals with higher reproductive success. Does that make sense? More or less? I think this is the big problem with any of these arguments. So try not to make arguments that say, the individuals will do something for the good of the group or for the good of the species, because that's really not what they're doing. We think selection favors individuals that maximize the number of their genes that go to the next population. And a lot of times that means having their own offspring. Sometimes that could mean helping, but it's got to be helping relatives that can therefore send some of their own genes into the next population. All right, I have to pause there. We're out of time.